Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs.
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right. And I'm assuming no gaming for you in the last few days.
It's what,
Since this is the
Monday?
same week.
No, none.
No, nor I.
You're indeed quite
Although I did, because this is a follow-up to our part one on dice mechanics, our episode on what we called the basic mechanic. I did spend some time yesterday writing ideas, a couple of pages for a system that I'm puttering with, actual like homebrew mechanic. So I've been in a dicey kind of mind for the last few days for sure.
Last episode we talked about
The basic mechanic, the most basic mechanic.
yeah,
Generate a number, compare it against another number.
Yeah, kind of additive. Well, we called it basic because
Yeah.
you call it other names. But
I think that your description of it was apt. And we also differentiated between a true dice pool system, which is what we're going to talk about today, and instead of just a pool of dice that you generate one number from, like West End Games' old Star Wars system, which is not a dice pool, even though you have a handful of dice. But so that's today's topic. We're going to talk about dice pools as a resolution mechanic and the ups, downs, the sideways. And you know what? I'll get to it. I was thinking about ways to describe it, but that is our topic for today. All right, how do we define a dice pool? How you look down, you see a bunch of dice together. Is it a dice pool? Is it just someone's mess? Or is it something else? What makes a dice pool resolution mechanic a dice pool resolution mechanic?
I think to me it's a dice pool rather than it's got to be a decent number of dice, but rather than essentially you're going to look at every die. You're not going to add them together. You're going to look at what they've got and something on them is going to go. So I'll give you an example of one that we're going to throw away straight away. So the narrative dice thing. So the kind of things that the thing that you get in Star Wars and Warhammer 3rd Edition and Genesis, where you roll some funky dice with little pictures on them. That's a dice pool system because you have to look at those dice. Now, we'll just throw that straight away because that is fine if you are a relatively big manufacturer that can make those dice. And otherwise, no.
Yeah, the fiddly, funky dice systems that require manufacturing of, development and manufacturing of little squiggly, proprietary dice symbols and stuff like that. Yeah, I'm going to take that off the list of things that I would ever endeavor to do. But you're right that those are. Think about the Star Wars narrative dice. Is that you consider each of the different kinds of dice differently because there are 3 different kinds of dice potentially that have different results on them. But then you adjudicate the result based on what you find on each of the dice faces. Yes. Or the die faces, and then you're not coming up with a sum. Of course, you can't come up with a sum of like little squiggly looking things, but yeah, point well taken.
So our most basic dice pool system would be something like either World of Darkness, which they're still using now, or Shadowrun, and there are other games, but those are the two biggest games that use it, where you roll a pool of dice, and the pool of dice is usually your stat. It's almost always stat plus skill. So World of Darkness, it's stat plus skill. Shadowrun, it's stat plus skill. So, World of Darkness, you might have 4 in your stat. You might have 3 in your skill. You roll 7 dice.
Yeah, and it's almost, in most cases, in World of Darkness, it's die 10s, only die 10s.
Yes.
And in my experience, the vast majority of true dice pool systems use the same die. You just use one type of die. For whatever this roll is going to be, you don't... Now, there are exceptions.
Yeah, we'll get to those on the back end, though. But
yeah, you roll your seven die 10s, and the goal is to typically meet or beat a specific fixed number or a specific number, a difficulty. And however many dice meet or exceed that number, say 7, is a success. And then you're counting up the number of successes. That was actually the first dice pool system I was ever exposed to. Was World of Darkness, Vampire the Masquerade, 2nd edition, in like 1993, I think it was.
Yeah.
That was the first one, and that was pretty revolutionary. It's interesting because the way I was thinking about it is that your your 5e die 20 uh, only gives you, call it like one axis of results, success or failure. Whereas a dice pool system gives you multiple axes of results in that you can, because you're rolling these additional dice, and this we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the basic mechanic, you not only determine success or failure, but depending on what else is done with those numbers, there could be degree of success. Or for example, like with Vampire the Masquerade, I remember one of the powers, one of the disciplines is awe. You know, you make people like you and think you're cool. And the number of people who can see you who are affected by the power is a result of how many successes you roll.
Yeah.
So you have multiple axes of results to determine based on a single roll of this pool of
Yeah.
dice,
I
which I
mean,
think is nifty.
that's one of the things I really like. There's because there's very easy ways to play with it. So, Shadowrun, you tend to have one difficulty. Like a 5 or above is it 5 or 6 is a success. But then you can have things that you spend edge. Right now, 4's a success.
Now, remind
Things
everybody,
like that.
Shadowrun traditionally uses what kind of dice?
D6s.
Okay, so if you're rolling a 5 or 6, you have a 1 in 3 chance on each die, and you're rolling a handful of dice. However many 5s and 6s you get is
Yeah,
how
way
many
more.
successes you get.
If you're doing Shadowrun properly, you're not rolling a handful of dice.
Well, maybe you have big hands. You know?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the jokes about Shadowrun is
Yeah.
that you can get it up, 20s. But I mean, Exalted, which is springs off of World of Darkness and still rolls D10s, has a similar thing that, you could get up to silly numbers where you can, you're rolling 10 plus dice. But the good thing is it's still really quick to do. Now, actually, in the case of things like World of Darkness and Exalted, once they changed at one point, rather than having a floating target number, like, oh, it can be 7, the GM can move it down to 5 or 6 if it's easier, and up to 8 or 9. They just started kind of going, well, 7 is the fixed number or 8 is the fixed number, which meant that then they released dice where, I mean, I've got vampire dice now from the newest edition where there's no numbers.
Right.
It's just 3 of these faces are symbols to show success, and one face, which presumably is the 10, is like a bigger one to show this is an uber success.
That's just a cash grab.
It is, but it makes it super easy to, when you roll the dice, super easy
True.
to see it because you roll the dice and you can instantly spot those are my successes.
Yep.
Right, those are ones, those are botches. And again, it's come back to your multiple axes. You can do things like a 10 is a double success, which you can't do in other systems.
No,
So, and you can also
not
do
as
things like
easily.
yeah, and a 1 is bad. And if you roll more ones than you roll successes, something really bad
Yeah.
happens. I mean, when I've played, so the 2 games I've played most recently, both Age of Sigmar Soulbound and Wrath and Glory, are dice pool systems. And in Wrath and Glory, like every one you roll, it's something bad happens. So that's kind of like 2d20. And if you roll a 20 for a complication, something bad happens. And actually, the more dice you roll, the more chance there is of getting a complication. But those
Yeah.
complications aren't failures. There's something that's going to happen as well as whether you succeeded. So we have
Yeah.
that double axis of we can have success and failure, but we can also have cool things happening and we can have other things happening as well as success and failure. And I think dice pools let you do that.
Yeah.
Whereas even things, so we've talked about sort of you can have degrees of success with, rolling under or rolling over and adding a number. But what you can't have is that dual axis. You
Right.
can once you've got dice pools because one dice can be a different color, or ones do this, or tens do. So there's other levers you can play with, which lets you do more.
Yeah.
And as well as that, you can have which dice size do you want? Do
Well, the other
D10s
thing
because
too is,
or do
you know,
D6s, whatever.
if you wanted to say, well, hey, I'm going to take 5e, I'm going to take your typical D20 power, single D20 powered system with a basic dice mechanic, and I'm going to institute degrees of success. Then you're sitting there doing math at the table by saying, well, you exceeded the armor class by 3 or 5, or it becomes headache inducing
Yes.
and it slows the game down. And then there's the question of where do you draw the lines? Um, by having multiple dice that are adjudicated individually and therefore can cough up different results, it gives you all these other options. I mean, what's interesting is you could, like, okay, year zero, the step dice method of year zero does have a degree of success, and the default is that how if you roll additional successes, it just goes into damage. Okay,
Yeah.
that or, that's and actually the default in the D6 dice pool mechanic for year zero is the same thing. That's the default. Now you could make life as a designer really easy and just say, well, yeah, surplus success equals more damage. It just does more of whatever it's seeking to do. Like, I don't know, maybe if you're researching a topic, you find out more stuff, something like that. But you don't have to use it that way. You could go ahead and take it and you could use it as a meta currency. You could do something else with it. Yeah. So just what I love about it is that it provides multiple possibilities with, I think, minimal additional fiddliness.
Yeah. Because it's very easy. So because you have two axes of making things easier and harder as well.
Yep.
So depending on how you want to write your rules, you can go, if it's easier, you have extra dice and we're going to keep with a fixed difficulty. So you're always rolling against 7. Or you can, again, you can have things like, well, we're going to move the target number up and down. So you're like on a D10, sticking with a D10. If it's easier, it's 5s and 6s, and if it's harder, 8s and 9s. Or you can have how many successes you need to roll. So there's lots of different things you can play with, which means that two dice pool systems do not have to be the same. I mean,
No.
if the two Warhammer ones, Wrath and Glory, you're always rolling. Oh, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think I haven't played for a while now. But like ones are bad, 6s are doubly good, and you roll 4s and 5s, and they're okay. But you're always rolling that. Now, in Age of Sigmar, that's completely different. You have some rolls, you can change the actual number you need on the dice. So you go like, right, well, you only need 4s, or you only need 5s, or you need a 6. If you need a 6, that's a really hard roll. And then on top of that, it's how many successes. So when you say roll, you say, right, it's a 4-2. A 4-2 means you need to roll 4s and you need 2 of them. Or you say
Okay.
it's a 5-1. You need to roll 5s,
Okay.
but you only need 1 of them. And if you get more successes than you needed, then you did better.
Yeah.
Um, and in combat, it's really straightforward because your combat roll is literally you look at the other person's defense. If it's equal to your attack, then you roll. It's right. It's 4s. However many 4s you roll, that's how much damage you do. Done.
Oh, easy.
Yeah, and then you add
I've
for like bigger weapons, but it's super dice pools. There are lots of ways that dice pools can just simplify the thing. But if you want loads of modify, like Shadowrun is a notoriously complex game, but it uses dice pools,
yeah.
and then you just add extra dice or you take dice away. Okay, then it's gone into stupid number porn. But at the end of the day, you still are just rolling d6s and you're looking for 5s and 6s. It's not difficult.
Yeah, going back to old World of Darkness, like I said, Vampire the Masquerade Second Edition, and the other games in that line, which some of which am somewhat familiar with, but play wise not very much. I remember that the default in a lot of cases the default difficulty was 6 or 7, and then you rolled the number of dice based on a stat and a skill. And sometimes it was a little different. Sometimes the target number, or the difficulty rather, was based on something else. Like for example, if you were rolling against another character and it was some kind of like mind control power, you would roll against their current willpower. I will admit that I never gave um, I never gave a whole lot of thought to probability back in the olden days. Um, but I reckon, and I still like, I don't have, I would never say that I have a deep understanding of like the maths behind probability. But when you start not only changing the difficulty, the target number, you change the number of dice,
Yeah,
you start complicating. Like if you're trying to, if as a designer, if you are out to make a game that will model certain kinds of results, like you want the world to feel like X. Like that's one thing I've been thinking about a lot as I've been puttering around with the idea for an original system is, well, if someone is average, say they're of average intellect, whatever that's supposed to be, and they are proficient in a given skill, how often under a moderately stressful circumstance, which is the only time you should start rolling, like when something is moderately stressful, where there's a time suspense attached to it, at least that's my thought. Um, how often would someone who's that succeed in such a situation? And that's a world modeling thing. And by adding these different possibilities for changing the target number, adding and subtracting dice, so on and so forth, I'm going to guess that you significantly muddy the waters for determining probability. If you're not that
Yeah.
hung up on it, if you're just kind of going by feel, then who cares?
Yeah. I mean, I suspect that's why when they went from World of Darkness around your first, second edition, and then they created New World of Darkness. And then, okay, then when they went, they changed the law as well as some of the rules. But then when they've moved on, they haven't gone back to the old rules. So we still don't tend to have separate rules for attack and damage. We still don't have that your target number changes. Pretty much they kind of stay to this. It's either 7 or 8, I can't remember. But generally now there is a
I think
default.
it's 8.
And there isn't a thing for moving that up and down. Like when Exalted came out, they just
Yeah.
went, your success is 7. 7 or above is a 6.
Yeah.
Anything less than a 7 is a fail. And they just stuck with that. And then it's about rolling lots of extra dice. And if things get better, you roll more dice. And if things get worse, you roll less dice. And then you have a difficulty of how many successes you need to get. But the number you roll on the dice is just a set rule.
And that's
Because
another thing also. That's a good point you just brought up, that I think the default in a lot of these dice pool systems is, okay, here's the number you have to meet or beat. And as long as you roll at least one of those successes, like that's how your 0 is, as long as, whether the dice step or the dice pool system, as long as you get at least one success, you are successful. You are minimally successful. There's nothing jazzy that you accomplished with it. But the idea of then adding in, well, the difficulty is 3, but you need to roll 2 of those, that muddies the waters even more.
Yeah. I mean, this is why 2d20 is a bit of a wit, because it's kind of a pseudo dice pool system. It is a dice pool system because you are rolling multiple dice and you are not adding anything together. But what you're looking for on those dice is not a fixed number. You are looking for a number based on your stats. Yep. And the number the dice you roll is not based on your stats. Most dice pool systems, the number of dice you roll is stat plus skill or something like that.
Yep.
2d20 is very different. You roll 2d20 and you roll extra dice if you spend meta currency to get extra dice. You roll against your stat. The better your stats are, the more chance you have in getting successes.
Yeah, stat and skill still.
So it's it is different in that sense. It's closer to some other, because there's something, D&D, instead of doing D20 plus, you could roll D20 and roll under your attribute and it would work fine. You're doing that with multiple dice in 2d20. So it's working differently to other dice pool systems. I can still consider it a dice pool system because it has the same kind of benefits and downsides. Yeah. Actually, I'm not really what the downsides are.
Yeah. I remember when I used to, like I said, 30 years ago, when I ran a bunch of Vampire the Masquerade, I picked up the Storyteller's Handbook, and the Storyteller's Handbook had an alternate combat system in it that I thought worked far better than the one in the rule book. And one of the things that it introduced, which I thought made a ton of sense, and once you got good with it, it didn't slow things down. If you were an reasonably organized GM, but that your initiative, that your difficulty for initiative varied depending on your situation. So for example, if you had a weapon out and you were, there were different descriptors. Like if your weapon was out and like pointed at the person, your initiative would be lower than if they were unaware of you. Their initiative would be higher. So you actually had different initiative difficulties potentially for different people depending on the situation. And again, I have no idea, if the White Wolf people sat down with a calculator and figured out, like, okay, here's the general probability in this situation, and that's why we're going to peg this number here, because that's the kind of feel that we want. Or did they just think, oh yeah, that sounds good, because it worked.
Yeah,
it worked. But yeah, I think the multiple axes, because you're using these additional dice, you can do different things with them, and it doesn't have to just be degree of success or failure. It can do other things for you. And I as a designer, if you're thinking, well, I'd like my dice mechanic to do a couple of things, a dice pool obviously gives you those different little places to add those.
Yeah. So generally, I like dice pools because there are different ways of doing them. Like we've already mentioned, for start, different kinds of dice. You can use D6s to use D20s. You can use I haven't seen many using D8s or D12, but you can use these we have these different dice, so use them. That's cool. The fact that we have degrees of success is very easy. Like the fact that you have multiple axes to change, very easy. There are other ways of playing this as well. So I've got 2 other ways I can think of how you can play with how dice pools work before we go into the other kind of weird side. Are they dice pools? Are they not? Kind of things. One is what things like the old Legend of the Five Rings and other Sims call what they call roll and keep, which becomes very straightforward. You roll as many, usually it's something like you roll as many dice as your statistic, your attribute,
Yeah.
and then you keep as many of those as your skill. So if you've got a strength of 5, you roll 5 dice, and if your sword skill is 3, you keep 3. And then that whether you add them or you check for the target number or whatever, same principle. But again, that's another way of, it's still a dice pool thing. You're still working on stat and skill. It's a different way of working with it. So it's another lever you can pull to like how you get the things to work, which
I've
is
also seen ones like that where instead of keeping a number of them, you roll a bunch of these dice, and they could even be different size. They could be different types of dice, and then you just pick. You take the one highest or the two highest or
yeah.
or something like that.
And then the other weird one I've seen, and this is what Outgunned uses, but I've seen it. Well, I can't remember. There's something called the one roll engine, which I can't remember well now, and I can't bother to go and look it up, see it. But I remember that was rolling. It was probably D10s, but something like that. But what you took at successes are very weird. So, like, if you rolled so many of a kind, you would take them together and add those to get your score. Or if you roll a straight, so if you happen to roll like, 2, 3, 4, well, then you could take those and stuff like that. It's kind of like doing poker stuff, but with the dice you roll. That always seemed a bit weird because it was like, I think the amount of different things you could do with it was needlessly complicated. I just remember reading it and going, okay, this just feels like someone's messing around with this rule set, but it's a thing you can do. The other one I've had, and I've played this twice this year, once with the Assassin's Creed game and once with Outgun, which is rolling matching dice. So when you roll Outgunned, you roll and you're looking for as many of a kind as you can. So if you get four of a kind, four of a kind's really good. And if you roll three of a kind, three of a kind's only like good. Two of a kind is like rubbish. It's like the minimum level success. And that's what your difficulty is, like 2, 3, or 4, where 4 is you have to roll a 4 of a kind. Now, that there's ways to make it easy. You roll your dice, right? You get a 3 of a kind. You can then take the others that didn't do it, roll them in again, hoping that they're going to come up with the number you already rolled. And if you roll 2 pairs, you can turn 2 pairs into a 3, or it counts the same. Which again, it was one of those things. It's just someone playing with
Yeah, I could see
how you
that.
put the successes together. Easily. There was no reason that Outgunned couldn't have just been, roll how many d6 is your stats plus skill is, because what you do anyway, and you're just counting 5s and 6s. They just decided to do something different. Right, we're going to go with this other thing. And
Yeah, and
Assassin's
who
Creed
knows
did
who knows
something
what their
similar.
motivation was. Was it a
Yeah,
desire to just do something? Hey, let's just make this feel novel. And then they believe on the math side of it, well, it doesn't make a whole ton of a difference. So let's just do something novel so we can say that's our
yeah,
system. It's not just like anybody or everybody else's. I could absolutely see situations where designers would get fiddly deliberately just to be different for no reason,
yes,
and it could
yeah.
lead to something being like cumbersome and stupid, but who knows?
I mean, in Outgun, they actually put the probabilities of like rolling with
Yeah.
how many dice you rolled, the chances of getting a 2 of a kind, a 3, a 4, and then with the re-roll, the chance of getting those. And they
Yeah.
put that in the book, and you think that is only in there for a very specific kind of player that wants to know the odds.
Yeah.
Because one thing that a lot of people do not like about dice pool systems is you can't easily calculate the odds.
It's a lot
You can
harder
to
for
some extent.
sure.
Like if you're doing D10s and you've got a target number of 7, it's actually not ridiculously difficult to work out. Like, right, I'm rolling this many dice. I need to roll this many successes. It's not that hard, but it's not as easy as on a D20. I
Right.
need to roll 15 or more.
Right.
It's just super easy. It's much harder than that. But as soon as you start messing around with like needing pairs, or if you roll this dice, this thing counts as double, that's when the odds start getting, and people can't work it out.
Yeah. Well,
And
I mean
actually, for
that
some
I've run
people,
into that. It's really
right.
when I was thinking about a dice pool mechanic, like I was, thinking about using, and this is just I'm pulling it out of the air. Well, not really. I was thinking about using die 12s, in part because the poor D12 gets no love.
Yeah.
Um, but what I was thinking about doing is, and I had a reason why I wanted to use die 12s, but the idea was, you'd roll and there would be a fixed difficulty, like kind of like New World of Darkness. The difficulty wouldn't float around, and you roll a certain number of dice, and you would need to get at least one success in order for the task to be successful. And then the default would be degrees of success if you roll more. And I didn't have any problem finding calculators that enabled me to determine if I rolled 5 die 12s, how likely is it to get at least one, that being the key, at least one that was at least a 10 or at least a 9 or whatever. Where it got wanged up and where it got difficult was not how likely is it to get two, or how likely is it to get only three, but how likely is it to get at least one? How likely is it to get you get at least two? How likely to get at least three?
Which
That's
is
where the
which is
math
why I
just
had
went.
to which is why I had to create a spreadsheet for you to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, so I understand that that's where it gets really difficult. And again, if a designer is really bent on modeling a certain kind of feel to the, I mean, look, if you say this game system is all about, fast, fun, exciting action and like badass running up the wall characters and your characters fail most of the time, well, that's not
Yeah.
that actually then is gameplay that does not produce what the copy says it is.
I mean, when I did my car PG, I used D8s for a couple of reasons. One, we were playing in the car. If you use 12s or 20s, they don't stay still after you roll them.
Right. You need something with bigger faces.
So I need something bigger faces. So actually, eights are pretty solid, and six. Obviously, I could have used sixes. I don't like using sixes for the simple reason that sixes are what normal board games have.
Yeah,
I
you want it to
have
feel
all these
different.
other. I have all these other dice. I want to use them. Also, Annie liked the idea of using D8s because D8s look like diamonds, which had relevance in League of Legends, which is what we were playing anyway.
Oh, that's
So,
cool.
there's other things there. So there was a whole bunch of, I went with D8s for not just the mathematical reasons. I went
Mm.
for physical reasons as an
Now,
aesthetic
I
reason.
went with, I was considering D12s because then the likelihood of rolling any one face on it is a little under 10%. It's like 8 and some percent. And so I liked the idea that if a 12 was going to be something exceptional and a 1 was going to be something bad, I liked it to be a little less likely than 10%.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to go with it anyway, but for that's beside the point.
Boo. Boo. Where's
Well,
our
I've come up with something that I think is going to work better, but that's a whole nother
better than
conversation.
D12s? I
Poor
think you're wrong.
D12s.
Ugh, why did I spend time working out your probabilities for you?
Uh,
Um, all right. So there's these other ones we want. Are we going to move on to them then? The
yeah, let's do
pseudo
that.
dice bowl. So there was two we mentioned when we were talking about after last episode. One I 100% I think is a dice bowl system, which is Cortex. Now, Cortex, the reason I will maintain it is a dice pool system is because you roll a bunch of dice.
Yes.
The thing is about how you use those dice. So in Cortex, I mean, it varies, but your average thing of Cortex is you will have a bunch of different things. You will have a distinction, so you're probably rolling a d8. You'll have a stat, probably, which could be anything from a 4, a 6, 8, 10, 12. And then you'll have some other things. You might roll between 3 dice up to 6 or 7, depending on which version. And actually, if other people have got like just effects on them or you've got extra bonuses, people help you. So let's say you're rolling 5 or 6 different dice, but the dice you roll means something. So you have D8 brave. That's just a listed thing. It's like a trait in 2d20. Your strength is D10. Your sword skill is a D12, so you roll that, and then
Yeah.
you have a sword which is rated at D8. So you roll those dice. Now, Cortex then does all kinds of complicated things with that because you could keep this simple. They could have just kept it to you take your 2 best dice, done.
Yeah.
But then
And,
they
and
have like,
either now those could either be now they wouldn't be added together because then technically that's not our definition of a dice
it
pool.
isn't. But in Cortex, that is what they do, which is why I say Cortex is pseudo dice ball because they could have just gone with, and this is what you said Mutant Year Zero does once they switch to step dice,
Yes.
just your highest dice. Mutant Year Zero just goes your highest dice.
Yeah, the step dice version of year zero, year zero, which is what Twilight 2000 uses, is you roll 2 dice, and however many 6 or aboves you get is a success, and you only
Yeah.
need one success to be successful. So obviously, if you're rolling a D8 and a D10, you could get 2 successes, or and also on that, if you roll a 10, 11, or a 12, that counts as 2 successes unto itself.
Yeah.
So
So I mean,
yeah,
Cortex could have gone with just your highest dice. They don't, because they take your two highest dice and they add those together.
Yeah.
But then you have talents that let you roll on a third dice, or you can spend meta currency to add in another dice, and then it starts getting. Then you have things for you can take this dice, take this out, and you split that into two. There's all kinds of messing around with dice. There's a point that Cortex, if you let it, feels like the dice the game.
Yeah.
Where someone wanted to be able to play with all of the polys except for D20 and have lots of ways of messing
That's what it's
around with the
called. It's called
dice.
DTG instead of VTM.
Yeah, that's what it just feels like, because
Yeah.
they starts becoming and then sometimes it works, sometimes it models what you're doing really well. The idea of right, Wolverine's going to claw someone, so when he claws someone, his dice becomes bigger because he's going to do it, but then there's more chance of destroying the scenery. There were some clever things in Marvel Heroic with it, like if you want to
Mhm.
fire a machine gun, you roll as many d6s as there are people in the area, but for every one you're going to hit a passerby. So sometimes it works really cleverly, other times it just seemed like needlessly complicated dice manipulation for no real
Well, I
gain.
think that the trouble is there are, and I think that that version of Cortex, and I saw this with Firefly, that I think in theory it sounded good, and in theory it has an appeal and it makes sense. But the problem is that in practice, when you add in like every different way you could potentially use dice, adding and subtracting dice to your pool, allowing you to, you know, rerolls or allowing you to use more than two dice or this or that. You just, there are so many different variables. There are so many different axes of potential results that it just gets so, it doesn't muddy the waters. It gets really confusing. And I think they went way wrong on that
I think the other thing I
because of
found
that. They took a theory and
yeah,
they took it to an obscene extreme.
is that things stopped feeling special very quickly. It just felt
Right.
that like everyone, and this is one danger with a dice pool thing, which just gets stale. This is the thing when I found with paragons. It depends how you define like the top level. When I made characters for I don't know, prowlers and paragons, whatever it's called, they kind of had a cap on like your main ability can't have more than 10. But then it meant that every character you created, so like this character throws fireballs. Their fireball thing is 10. Captain America's shield is 10. Thor's hammer is 10. It's
Mm.
like everybody's main attack would be rolling 10 dice and then just comparing it to what the bad guy rolled. And so after a while, I started to feel like these all feel samey, because actually you do need some rules underpinning them. And one of the problems in Cortex is that every rule in some versions of Cortex is adding or altering or doing something else with a dice. There's not a rule behind it which
Mm-mm.
actually means so. Like at least in if you look at Fate, Fate has your aspects and stuff. They have a mechanical and a narrative thing, so they're doing
Yeah.
something. In 2D20, we have talents and we have effects and so on, so which are doing other things. So sometimes you do need some little roles, but that rules alongside your mechanism to stop things just feeling a bit samey. I mean, maybe not Shadowrun levels of too many
Right,
extra.
right. But I think
Still,
the problem that I found with Cortex was that especially when you're adding, you have all the like, well, here's a die for how strong you are, and here's a die for how skilled you are with the sword, and here's another die for how good the sword is, and then here's another die because it's Tuesday and you got a girlfriend, and here's another die because blah 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 blah. And then what it ends up being is like you're however you are distinct gets blurred because
yes,
it's like everything gets poured in,
yeah,
and yeah, I don't like
yeah.
actually how that worked
I think
out at the table at all.
you've absolutely nailed it. Then it becomes very difficult to like, is that D10 you've got because you are, is it because you're brave, or is it
Right.
because you're strong, or was it because of the girlfriend, or was it because it's dark, or and it's just a bunch of dice in a
Yeah.
pull. Now, actually, that is exactly the same as with other things, but with it's meant to feel different, and it ends up almost
Not.
doing the opposite, which is weird. But it's a feel thing, and sometimes the feel of a game makes a difference.
Sure it does.
Now, adjacent to that, and I'd have to say this isn't a dice pool game, but it doesn't fit into anything else we've done so far.
Okay.
So we're throwing it in here. Is Savage Worlds. Now, why are we throwing that in here? Because Worlds, you roll different dice depending
Yep.
on your stat. Your stat, again,
A
like we've said with
dice.
Cortex, yeah, like Mutant Year Zero, newer versions, is a dice. Your stats, you have 5 stats. Your stats are starts at D4. They go 4, 6, 8, 10. 12, and I think after that they go 12 plus 1, 12 plus
Yeah.
2. They
Yeah.
don't jump. And your skills are then based off those, and you make them go bigger. And when you roll, if you roll for bad guys, that's all you roll. They just roll that number, and a player you roll. You always get to roll this d6 as well. It's your wild dice because
Yeah.
you're a wild character. Woo! Because it's
A
fast, furious, and
wild
fun.
card. Yeah.
Um, but you roll a dice. One good thing about Savage Worlds, and this is why it is quick and easy. Your target number is always a 4.
Yeah.
That's it.
Four or
If you get a
above.
4 or more, you succeeded. Well done. And so chances are, people go like, oh, well, you succeed loads in Savage Worlds. Yes, that's the point. You said this earlier. In a game where it's meant to be fast, furious, fun, you should succeed most of the time.
Yep.
Well, Savage Worlds get that one, right? You virtually always succeed. Savage Worlds then falls over because of their combat rules, but that's a different thing. We're not doing
Yep.
combat
Totally
yet.
different. But so you roll a 4 or higher, and you are not. Are you adding your dice in Savage
No,
Worlds?
no, that's one thing that confuses people. When I've played with Savage Worlds bit, because they're rolling only 2 dice, they want to add them.
But
And
you're
you're like,
not.
no, you just take the highest one. Now, the thing that then makes it more complicated is if your dice rolls a top number, it explodes. So if you roll a 6 on a d6, you then do add it. You roll another d6 and you add it on. If you keep rolling sixes, you can get
You keep
silly
going.
big numbers, which is one of the problems where, on the one hand, it's fun when dice explode, which is something you can do in lots of these systems. You can do exploding dice. Where it goes wrong is the maths then goes wonky because you're then capable of getting these silly numbers, which
Yeah.
then can break stuff. You also have this weird thing that a D4 is mathematically better than a
Yeah.
D6 because the chance of rolling a 4 and
It's
therefore rolling a second
25%
D4
instead
is
of a little
24%.
16 or 17%.
So
Yeah.
you have this very weird roll. If you actually work out the probability, I mean, you can't because it's never ending, but at some point, the chance it becomes so small that you don't count the extra dice. A D4 is statistically better than a D6.
So really quickly, for those people who have not had fast, furious fun playing Savage Worlds, you roll a certain number of dice.
Just two.
You roll 2. You read them separately. Any 4 or
Yeah.
above is a success. If you roll max on either or both of the dice you roll, you keep rolling them. You add those. You'd have 2 individual numbers that are
Yeah. But
piling up.
you keep them separate,
Yes.
which is where it's a bit confusing.
Yeah. And but I mean, I also know that if you exceed, when do you get what they call a raise, which
I
then
think it's
gives you
5.
yeah, at
I think it's
5
so if you
above.
yeah,
So
I think it's 5 above and then 10 above because you can get 2 raises. So that helps
yes.
with damage. Like you usually have to, well, you either have to have like a big number which can roll a 9 or a 10, or you have to explode your dice.
Yeah.
And then getting a raise makes your, if it's damage, you'll get more damage
Yeah.
dice. It ends up being far too reliant on raises. So this thing, like the getting the 4 is easy. You get 4 all the time. So you succeeded. Where it goes wrong is some of the things after that. But actually, the basic dice thing is very easy to just
Yeah, it is.
look at your stat, roll that. You just have to remember, you've got to roll a d6 as well. So a lot of the time as a GM, you're going, oh, don't forget to roll a d6 as well. Straight away, the exploding dice confuses it because people are like, oh, my 6 explodes. So I roll both the dice. No, just the d6. Okay, roll a
Yeah.
d6 again. So what do I add this to? Well, the 6 you roll. It's where you want to have a bunch of dice. You can just keep rolling them and keep them in a row. But
Yeah.
if you've only got one of each type, it can get messy. But again, it's not really a dice pool, but it also doesn't work with the stuff we were talking about previously. Savage Worlds is very much its own thing.
Yeah.
And there are some good ideas.
I personally would say that it's a dice pool. However, it is not it's definitely not a standard kind of dice pool system. But it does give you degrees of, and it does give you and you are dealing with each dice separately. So those are my must-have qualifiers for something being a dice pool. What do you think the major advantage, like the top? I know we've hit them, but just in some summary here, what are the main advantages and disadvantages of a dice pool system?
Taking out Savage Worlds and Cortex because they are pseudo dice pool systems and they have different problems. To me, dice pool systems don't really have a disadvantage, which is, I guess, an advantage. I like the fact you've got multiple levers to play with because you've got the number you need to roll on the dice.
Yep.
You've got how many dice you roll. You've got how many dice need to hit that target number. And then you've got the particular results on the dice. Like, does 1 do something? Does 6 do something? Or 8 on a D8 or whatever. You've got lots of different things to play with. And that's why I think dice pools are really, really good because you have so many ways of taking this idea of, I'm going to take X number of certain dice size and I'm going to roll them against a certain number. There's so many different levers you can play with that you don't have with, I'm going to roll a D20 and I'm going to add a number, or I'm going to roll 2d6 because now I've got a bell curve. Ooh, and I'm going to, I'm going to add it. I guess the downside is it's the maths.
Yeah.
Okay, the maths becomes hard to work, and it's kind of thing they probably need play testing more because
Yeah.
the maths is harder to work. You do need to look at, right, what am I better off going? I'm going to make, think things like your target number. Like on a D12, what's the sweet spot?
Yep.
Should I have it be 7 or above, or should I go 8, or should I go 9? The
Yeah.
very fact that in World of Darkness versus Exalted, World of Darkness is an 8 and Exalted is a 7, because in Exalted your characters are meant to be better.
Yeah.
But that's a big shift. And it sounds like, oh, it's only 10% different. Yeah, but it's 10% on every dice you roll, which then starts, it makes the math very different.
I agree. I agree with you on both of those. I think that having the multiple axes, depending on what you want to model, depending on if you have a feel, and you should, I mean, if you're designing a game and you're thinking about the mechanics, you should be directly thinking about how will those mechanics be likely to produce the feel and the flow at the table that I'm going after. Otherwise, I mean, dice rolling could, or whatever it is, could just be a resolution mechanic all by itself. But if it's not supporting how the game is supposed to feel, I question, why are you using that dice mechanic or resolution mechanic? And it provides you with that. But if you're really a stickler for some idea of like your idea of, like, as you said, the probability sweet spot, it's a lot more difficult. I'm fine with that, but I think it's a lot more difficult.
I mean, it is, but there's certain things, you know what the probability of one dice, and you know that when you change these levers, it's going to affect it. Do you need to know exactly what the probabilities are?
I think some people think they do.
Probably. I think
some designers think that they do.
But then I also see things like the first version of Marvel Multiverse that I got last year, where the probabilities were so shot to pieces. You had characters that could never hit other characters and other ones that never missed, and you're like, well, they didn't look at the probabilities.
Well, you know what though, you just accounted for that by saying that, I mean, let's face it, the more complicated probability issues with dice pool systems require more playtesting, especially if you're going to set this up in a world that everybody knows. And people have a sense of, well, Wolverine can't do that or can do that. Well, he ought to be able to can or can't do it in the game. The dice cannot preclude that which a known character can already do.
I think although the probabilities are harder to calculate with dice pools, I think it's harder to break them. Like usually throwing in an extra, having a kind of rule like, oh, if you have advantage, you get an extra dice. It doesn't really break things in a dice pool system. It's one extra dice. You get to, what does is kind of like you lower the target difficulty by 1. That's massive. But if we look at 2D20 where they go traits, traits, they make something easier or harder. That's increasing the difficulty by 1 or lowering it by 1. It doesn't break the system.
No, it doesn't.
So they can just throw it in there knowing that it doesn't, get an extra
pushes
dice
it one direction or another, but you're right. It doesn't. Yeah.
But, they've capped that system at you never roll more than 5 dice because they know at a certain point you just get silly numbers of successes.
Yeah.
Where in other systems, like, your roll, the number they've picked is to make sure, right, well, if you're rolling sort of this many dice, you should get this many successes. And therefore, that's our sweet spot and we can kind of work with it. I mean, I think you do have to be careful about how many dice you roll. I think when you roll 1 or 2 dice, it feels like, particularly if your difficulty number is you have to get 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 successes. I mean, I've definitely had this in playing like Soulbound, where like, right, guys, you need to roll a 6 and they're rolling 4 dice. And it's like, this is rough.
Yeah.
It's like luck. Or when they have to get 2 5s and things like that, it becomes very, very difficult. But at the same time, so rolling sort of 3 or 4 dice it's difficult. Once you start rolling like 9 or 10 dice, you're going to hit the target numbers, probably. But then when you go Shadowrun numbers and you're rolling sort of 15, 20 dice, that's probably too many dice. Yes.
Right on. So again, like, subscribe, ring the bell, share with your friends, join the conversation. If there are dice pool systems about which or you're familiar that we didn't mention, we didn't talk about Year Zero's dice pool system much at all, let us know. Really let us know what you think.
Or some other weird dice mechanic we've completely forgotten about.
Absolutely, I would love to know.
System. Yeah, weird and wacky ones.
Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.